Juicy, tender venison backstrap, beautiful concoction of mushrooms, shallots, garlic, a touch of wine, savory prosciutto, all wrapped up in a crusty, crispy, golden brown pastry. I'm talking about Wellington, in this case, Venison Wellington. Particularly common to make with beef, the Wellington is sort of a high-end, fancy, highfalutin dinner made pretty popular by the chef Gordon Ramsay on his TV shows. It's one of his signature dishes, and it seems like one of those things that is oft recreated or imitated across the YouTube culinary world. And when done right, a properly made Wellington is a cornucopia of flavors and textures, and I really can't think of a lot of recipes that are more enjoyable to eat and probably even make. So like I've been saying with all these venison videos, if you want to try something pretty different from the old venison recipes you've been making your whole life, this might be something you want to give a shot. So let's jump right into it, and the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the cut of meat that will make up the core of our Venison Wellington. Alright, so here's the back strap we're going to be using for our Wellington, and this isn't the entire length of the back strap, it's probably about half of it, maybe, give or take. And we just got to do a little bit of cleaning up on this thing before we can move forward. And first thing I'm going to do is kind of square it up a bit and decide the piece that I want to kind of use. So it tapers down kind of at this end, and I've got this little bit of stuff here, and I'm probably going to need to trim some of this off just to get my nice piece of meat. I don't want to totally narrow up the whole circumference of this thing, but I'm kind of going to need to. And as far as how long I want to go, well, it starts to taper pretty good at this end, and maybe I'll go something like right here. That'll be a pretty nice piece of meat to do this with. So now I've pretty much just got to slice off and remove as much of this silver skin as I can. I want to do that without really taking any of the good meat off, which is something I'm not especially expert at. So I'm just going to do my best. And there we are. I'm going to wrap this up, stick it in the fridge for a bit, and start moving on with our next step. Now, because this piece of meat isn't especially cylindrical shaped, I'm going to tie it up with some butcher's twine for the next couple steps. The only purpose of this is to sort of squish and reshape this backstrap to be a bit more round. You could look at this step as optional, and its main purpose is just to end up with a more symmetrical and pretty final product. Next, I'm going to season pretty heavily with kosher salt and coarse ground black pepper, making sure to get all sides and even those short ends. Now to heat up some olive oil in a cast iron skillet. I want that oil pretty hot so I can get a nice sear on my piece of meat. When I set that backstrap in, I'm looking for a good strong sizzle. I'll let each side sear for a good minute until the entire surface is nicely browned. Then I'll set the meat in the refrigerator for 20 to 30 minutes, which is just about how much time the next step will take. Any classic Wellington recipe is going to call for Duxelles, which is basically a minced up concoction of mushrooms and some other ingredients. For mine, I'll be using cremini mushrooms, shallot, garlic, fresh thyme, and a touch of cooking sherry. And I could finally chop up all these ingredients by hand, but since I really just need to break them down into a somewhat fine mince, I'm going the lazy route and using a food processor. I'll just throw in 2/3 of a pound of cremini mushrooms, 1 shallot bulb, roughly chopped, and 4 cloves of garlic. And let the food processor do its thing. It doesn't take much, just a few seconds really. You don't want to turn this into an absolute sludge, so take care not to overdo it if you use a food processor. And when my mixture looks something like this, I'll melt a big hunk of butter in that same cast iron skillet I browned the venison in, and then toss in my Duxelles mixture, And right away, I'll season with a good pinch of kosher salt and black pepper, and then throw in a few thyme sprigs. Now I just have to cook this all down until nearly all of the liquid is reduced. Mushrooms release a ton of water when cooked, and I want most of it gone. Just saute on medium heat, stirring occasionally for around 10 minutes or so. When the moisture is mostly gone, I'll go ahead and pull those thyme sprigs out and discard them, and then add my sherry. Stir that all in, and once again, I'm letting it go until practically all of that sherry is cooked off and reduced. And when that happens, I'll scoop everything out of the pan right away and set it aside until I'm ready for it. Now we're bringing that seared venison back into the mix. I'll cut and remove all that butcher's twine since I need it out of the way at this point. Then I'll brush a nice even coating of Dijon mustard all over all sides of the backstrap. I don't especially love mustard, but this is a classic preparation of a Wellington, and when it's all cooked, you really only taste a hint of it. I like a hint of mustard, but when I made my first Wellington, I was afraid it was going to be super mustardy, considering how much I was slathering on there. Now we're going to start assembling the main internal components of this thing. After laying out a couple sheets of plastic wrap, I'm going to put down 6 big slices of prosciutto, overlapping each of them by about 1/2. This will basically be the outer layer before the puff pastry comes into play. Next, I'm bringing back those Duxelles, and it's time to start spreading them down over top that prosciutto. I like to do this part with my fingers because the mixture is pretty dense and I want to spread it out until it's an even, consistent layer across nearly the entire surface area of the prosciutto. It just doesn't spread well enough with a utensil, in my opinion, so I'll sculpt it and spread it until it's just shy of the prosciutto edges. And then I'm laying down my mustard-coated venison log right on top, right near one edge. And using the plastic wrap to help, I'll carefully roll the meat up in that Duxelles-coated prosciutto, wrapping it as tightly as possible without risking separating or splitting that prosciutto. Once it's neatly rolled up, I'll tightly wrap the whole thing in that plastic wrap, twisting the ends to make the whole thing very snugly sealed. Now I'm putting this whole thing back in the fridge for another 20 to 30 minutes. And when I'm just about ready to move on, I'll do 2 things. I'll preheat my oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll get my puff pastry ready. And while I'd love to say that I made this from scratch, I did not. I'm pretty sure that I can't make a better puff pastry than what I can buy, so that's what I, and most people, do. For my little Venison Wellington, I don't need this square of dough to be much larger, but I need it to be a little larger. I also want it just a little thinner, so on a floured surface, I'll gently roll it out just a little bit. When it's ready, I'll unwrap my log of Duxelles and meat and start carefully rolling it up in the pastry. I don't want a bunch of overlapping crust at the seams, so once I determine how much I need to wrap it all the way around, I'll trim off the excess with a knife. Then brush on a little egg wash at the seam to help glue it together. Close it up and carefully pinch the seam together all the way down. Now for the ends. I have a bit too much on here too, so I'll give these sides a trim. Then do my best to fold, twist, and pinch closed those ends, making sure they're fully closed and sealed. Next, I'll carefully move the whole thing to a parchment-lined cooking sheet. Then I'll brush it all over the top and sides with egg wash. Don't try to egg wash the very bottom where it's sitting, but try to get as much of the top and sides as you can. And now I'll slice some very shallow decorative slits into the pastry. This is purely for aesthetics, and you can do whatever design you want here. I'll keep mine pretty simple. Finally, a sprinkle of coarse salt over top, and it's ready for the oven. But because it's far too easy to over or undercook a Wellington, I'm bringing in my cheap probe thermometer. I can insert this metal probe deep into the middle of the venison, while the digital display stays on the outside of the oven. These are built such that you can just close the oven door on the wire, and you have a real-time readout of the meat's internal temperature. And with this model, as I'm sure most of them do, I can set an alarm to go off when it hits my target temperature. I want medium rare, so I'm pulling it out of the oven at 135 degrees. This ought to take about 40 minutes, which gives us the perfect amount of time to whip up a little pan sauce to drizzle over top of our finished Wellington. I'm going with a pretty basic sauce that's sort of similar to a Marsala sauce, except I'll bring back some of that sherry instead of using actual Marsala wine. I'll start by finely mincing up 1 shallot bulb, and then finely mince 4 cloves of garlic. I'll give my skillet a quick wipe to get any larger bits of Duxelles out of there so they don't burn. Then get some butter melted and throw in the shallot and garlic, followed immediately by a pinch of kosher salt and black pepper. Give that just a minute to saute. It won't take very long at all before you risk burning them, so don't walk away at this point. And then I'm pouring in my sherry. I'll let that sherry simmer away until it's reduced by about 2/3. Then I'll add in a couple teaspoons of tomato paste, followed by a couple teaspoons of soy sauce. Alternatively, you could use Worcestershire sauce instead of soy. A quick stir, and then I'll add a cup of beef stock. Now to let this all simmer for a few minutes until it starts to thicken up a bit. And because I want a nice smooth sauce, I'll go ahead and separate out the solids with my fine mesh strainer, making sure to press down on all those solids to squeeze out every last bit of precious sauce. Then I'll put the sauce back into a small saucepan, since I don't need that big old skillet at this point. Heat the sauce back up for just a couple minutes, and then I'll stir in 2 pads of cold butter, just to make my sauce even more smooth, velvety, and rich. Now my sauce is done, and I'll just leave it on the stove on very low heat until the Wellington is ready for it. And by the way, if your sauce seems a little too thin, stir in a very small amount of cornstarch slurry. Just mix 1 teaspoon of cornstarch with 1 teaspoon of cold water, and then stir that into the sauce. Don't do more than this for a batch this size, or you'll end up with pudding. At long last, the Wellington is out of the oven and looking absolutely beautiful. I've got it on a wire rack, and I need to let it rest for a full 10 minutes before slicing into it. It's a painful exercise in patience, but it's a very necessary step. And finally, it's time to slice in and see how we did. If that's not a sight to behold, I don't know what is. I could have stood for this to be slightly more rare, but nevertheless this Wellington looks utterly mouth-watering. You can see how juicy that meat is, and look at those layers, not to mention the impossibly flaky golden brown crust. All that's left to do is serve up a slice. Drizzle over some of that sauce, some gratuitous parsley garnish, and now a taste. If you've ever had a Wellington, beef, venison, or otherwise, I don't need to sell you on how delicious it is and why you should eat one. There's just so many different things going on, so many layers of things. Of course, the beautiful piece of venison and the Duxelles, the prosciutto, you get that little touch of the Dijon mustard in there, and the crispy, beautiful puff pastry holding it all together. Yeah, it's a pretty elaborate recipe, and it's probably more work than most people will consider worth it for your average run-of-the-mill Tuesday night dinner. But if you're looking to make something really special for a nice occasion or to impress somebody, you really can't beat a Wellington to accomplish that. It's not really especially hard. There's just a lot of steps, and it's a bit time-consuming. And yeah, I think I overcooked it by about 5 degrees. I pulled it out of the oven at 135. I should have come out at 130, but the meat was still super tender and juicy. It just didn't have quite that medium rare appearance to it when I cut into the thing. Nevertheless, I do highly recommend one of those probe thermometers if you're going to make something like this, because it would have been pretty easy to way overcook it if I didn't have that thermometer. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, I'll have a link in the video description to the full recipe, including every ingredient that I used here. And be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including the upcoming episodes of my, quote, unofficial venison series. Make sure the food you're eating is made out of food. And until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.